The dive was a clean, sharp tear in the fabric of the afternoon, in the opulent, sun-drenched silence of the Whitmore Mansion's annual garden party. Tiago Santos's plunge into the crystal-clear pool sounded less like a splash and more like a gunshot. 40 of the city's elite, a curated collection of old money and new power, froze mid-sip, their champagne flutes held aloft, their polite chatter instantly silenced. Their eyes, accustomed to observing the world from a safe, comfortable distance, were fixed on the disturbance in the water. The disturbance was Isabella Whitmore. At 15, she was the fragile, beautiful centerpiece of her father's world. A world that had been defined and constrained by her cerebral palsy, her adaptive aquatic chair. A marvel of modern engineering designed to give her a semblance of freedom in the water, had failed. A latch had given way, a strap had come loose, and the chair, with Isabella still in it, was slowly, inexorably, sinking to the bottom of the deep end. Panic, stark and wide-eyed, had seized her face. Her arms, which she could control only with immense effort, flailed weakly against the water, a silent, desperate ballet of distress. Someone has to do something. A woman in a wide-brimmed hat had shrieked, her voice a shrill note of alarm that did nothing to break the spell of collective inertia. Her designer shoes, like those of everyone else present, remained firmly, safely planted on the hot Italian marble surrounding the pool. They were observers, not participants, in the messy, unpredictable dramas of life. Tiago didn't think, he didn't weigh the consequences, or consider his place in this gilded ecosystem. He was the son of Dona Carmen, the woman who had quietly and efficiently cleaned this magnificent house for 12 years. He was the 17-year-old boy who had spent countless afternoons doing his homework at the kitchen table while his mother worked. The boy who knew every shortcut through the manicured gardens, every loose floorboard in the staff quarters. He knew that Isabella, despite her father's immense wealth, was a prisoner in her own body. And he knew, with an instinct that bypassed thought, that she couldn't save herself. In a few powerful strokes that seemed to defy the tense, suspended and amber atmosphere of the party, he reached her. The water was a cool shock against his skin, a different world from the hot, humid air above. He saw the terror in her eyes, the last of her breath escaping in a stream of silver bubbles. With a practiced efficiency that belied his age, he unbuckled the straps that held her to the submerged chair, freeing her from the anchor that was pulling her down. He wrapped a strong arm around her chest and kicked for the surface. His lungs, burning, they broke through into the world of sound and light, Isabella's breath returning in a series of ragged, desperate gasps. He swam her to the edge, where a forest of hands, finally spurred into action by the reality of the situation, reached out to help pull her from the water. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse with water and relief. She clung to his arm, her grip surprisingly strong, her eyes wide and blue like the pool she had almost drowned in, fixed on his with a look of pure, unadulterated gratitude. It was in that moment, a moment of raw human connection, that Richard Whitmore appeared. He moved through the crowd of his guests like a shark, parting them with the sheer force of his presence. His face, usually a mask of tanned, patrician composure, was a mottled, furious red, but his anger, Tiago quickly realized, was not directed at the faulty equipment, or the inattentive guests, or the near tragedy that had just unfolded. It was directed at him. "What the hell are you doing in the social area?" he roared, his voice a whip-crack of command that made several of the guests flinch. He loomed over Tiago, who was still kneeling by the pool, dripping water onto the pristine marble, his cheap t-shirt and jeans a stark, jarring contrast to the linen suits and silk dresses that surrounded him. "Didn't your mother teach you to stay in your place?" Tiago looked up at the millionaire, his expression one of disconcerting calm. At 17, he had already learned a fundamental truth about the world he inhabited. Men like Richard Whitmore did not see people like him. They saw uniforms, they saw job descriptions, they saw potential threats to their perfect, well-ordered world. They did not see heroes, they did not see saviors. They saw a boy who had crossed a line, who had dared to step out of his designated, invisible box. "Dad, he saved me." Isabella tried to intervene, her voice still weak but laced with a new, indignant strength. "Shut up, Isabella," her father snapped, not even glancing at her. His fury was a laser beam, focused entirely on the boy who had dared to touch his daughter, to be the hero in a story where he was supposed to be the only one. "You shouldn't have been using that defective equipment in the first place. I told you it wasn't ready." He turned back to Tiago, his eyes narrowed to slits. "And you, kid, you're going to regret setting foot where you weren't invited. I promise you that." As Tiago watched the scene unfold, as he saw the gratitude in Isabella's eyes being eclipsed by the fear of her own father, something inside him settled. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was a quiet, cold resolve. There was a serenity in his eyes, a stillness that only exists in those who have weathered far worse storms and have learned, through necessity, exactly how to navigate them. He had been underestimated his entire life. He had learned to use it as a shield, as a camouflage. Today he realized he was going to have to learn to use it as a weapon. In the 48 hours that followed the rescue, the Whitmore mansion became a social and emotional battlefield. The war was quiet, civilized, waged with whispered phone calls and icy glares, but it was a war nonetheless. Richard Whitmore, a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his environment, had been publicly embarrassed. His daughter's vulnerability had been exposed. And worse, she had been saved not by one of the powerful, influential men he courted, but by the son of his cleaning lady. It was a narrative he could not abide, and he moved swiftly to correct it. His first act of retribution was swift and brutal. He fired Donna Carmen. The official reason, conveyed through his tight-lipped personal assistant, was a breach of security protocol for allowing her son to frequent restricted areas of the property. The irony was a bitter pill for Carmen to swallow. She was being punished because her son had saved her employer's daughter. "You have 24 hours to vacate the staff quarters," Richard had declared to her over the phone, his voice as cold and unforgiving as a January frost. "And I don't want that brat of yours setting foot on this property ever again. I'm being generous by not suing you for trespassing and endangerment." Isabella, from the confines of her luxurious bedroom, had tried to intercede. She argued, she pleaded, she cried. But each attempt to defend Tiago and his mother only seemed to harden her father's resolve, to fuel his need to reassert his absolute control. With each protest, a new punishment was enacted. First, he confiscated her phone and her laptop, severing her connection to the outside world. Then, he forbade her from taking her adapted swimming lessons, the one activity that gave her a sense of freedom and independence, using the accident as a pretext. Finally, he hired a stern, round-the-clock private nurse, a woman whose primary job, it seemed, was not to care for Isabella, but to watch her, to ensure she was cut off from any and all unauthorized contact. Her home, once a gilded cage, had become a maximum security prison. "You don't understand, sweetheart," Richard had explained, his voice laced with the false, condescending patience that wealthy people so often use when they want to appear reasonable. "People like them, they form emotional attachments to take advantage of us. That boy didn't save you out of kindness. He saw an opportunity. He was looking for a reward, a handout. It's how their minds work." But Isabella knew better. She had known Tiago for years, not as a servant, but as a quiet, constant presence in the background of her life. She remembered the long, lonely afternoons when he would sit with her in the library while his mother worked, helping her with the homework her expensive private tutors couldn't make her understand. She remembered the books he would borrow from the public library for them to read together. Stories of adventure and magic that transported her far beyond the manicured grounds of the estate. She remembered the silly, clever jokes he would tell to make her laugh on the difficult days. The days when the pain of her physical therapy was almost too much to bear. Richard, a man who saw the world as a series of transactions, could never understand that some people were motivated by something other than money. He could never comprehend a currency of kindness, of empathy, of simple human connection. Meanwhile, in the small, cramped rental house they had been forced to move into, Tiago displayed a serenity that would have intrigued any psychologist. At 17, he had developed an impressive, almost unnerving ability to metabolize injustice, to turn every slight, every act of prejudice, into fuel for something greater. "Mom, don't worry," he said calmly, as he arranged his schoolbooks on the small, wobbly kitchen table. "We'll be fine." "Son, I know you're smart," she warned, her hands still trembling from the humiliation of being escorted off the Whitmore property by two stone-faced security guards, her belongings hastily thrown into black trash bags. "But Richard Whitmore, he has power, he has money. Men like that, they destroy lives on a whim, just because they can." Tiago looked up from his books and smiled. It was not the bitter, resentful smile of someone who accepts defeat. It was something else, something much more dangerous. It was the calm, focused smile of someone who had just been handed the motivation he had been waiting for his entire life. "Mum, do you remember the story you always told me about Grandpa?" he asked, his voice quiet and steady. "How he built our first house, back in Alabama, brick by brick, even when everyone told him a black man would never own property in that neighborhood." Carmen nodded. a flicker of memory in her tired eyes, not understanding where her son was going with this. He didn't build that house to prove that he was right, Tiago said, his gaze intense. He built it to prove that they were wrong. He opened his laptop, an old battered model he had pieced together himself from discarded parts, and the screen flickered to life. Richard Whitmore thought he knew him. He thought he was just a scared kid from the wrong side of the tracks, a boy who could be easily intimidated, easily dismissed. On the screen a blank web page waited. Tiago had taught himself to code when he was 13, after finding a broken computer in a junkyard. His fingers, long and nimble, flew across the keyboard with the fluid precision of a concert pianist. "What are you doing, Mijo?" Carmen asked, a note of apprehension in her voice. "Research," he replied. The answer was simple, deceptively so. But there was something in his tone, a quiet, humming intensity, that made his mother realize she was witnessing the birth of something much larger than a simple teenage act of rebellion. Over the next few days, while Richard Whitmore celebrated his swift, decisive victory over the Santos family, confident that he had put them back in their place, Tiago immersed himself in a vast, invisible universe of public information, business records, political donations, court cases, government contracts, property deeds. It was all there, a vast, interconnected web of data, waiting for someone smart enough, someone patient enough, to connect the dots. And Tiago Santos, the son of a cleaning lady, a boy with no father, no money, and no connections, was about to teach the powerful Richard Whitmore a lesson he would never forget. Never, ever, underestimate the intelligence of someone who has everything to gain and absolutely nothing to lose. Each new discovery, each uncovered connection, made his eyes shine with an intensity that his mother recognized, but which also frightened her. It was the same gleam he'd had as a child when he'd taken apart that old radio. The pure, unadulterated joy of someone who had just figured out exactly how all the pieces fit together. He wasn't just looking for revenge, he was an empire asterisk a week after his humiliating dismissal from the only home he had ever known. Tiago had transformed their cramped kitchen into a veritable command center. The wobbly table was now a constellation of old, mismatched laptops, 3 of them, salvaged from junkyards and meticulously repaired, their screens glowing in the pre-dawn hours. He navigated a labyrinth of public databases, corporate filings, and archived news articles with the speed and precision of a seasoned intelligence analyst. He slept in 2-hour increments, his mind a relentless engine of data, correlation, and pattern recognition. "Son, it's 3 in the morning," Carmen would murmur, appearing in the kitchen doorway in her worn robe, her face etched with a mother's. "Worry, you need to sleep. You have school in a few hours. 15 more minutes, Mum," he would reply, his eyes never leaving the screens. "I'm almost done with an important part." What Carmen didn't know, what she couldn't yet comprehend, was that her son was peeling back the layers of the Whitmore empire like an onion, and at its core he was finding something rotten. Richard Whitmore, the man who presented himself to the world as a pillar of the community, a self-made real estate mogul, had a history, a long sordid history of hushed labor lawsuits, of suspiciously lucrative government contracts, of a complex network of shell companies that seemed designed for the sole purpose of obscuring the flow of money. It was a house of cards, built on a foundation of influence peddling and intimidation, and Tiago was carefully, patiently, mapping out its every weakness. At school, in the bright, ordinary world of teenage concerns, Tiago found the perfect, unexpected ally. Professor Janet Morrison was a former investigative journalist, a woman who had once exposed a political scandal that had shaken the state capitol to its foundations. The blowback had been intense, the threats against her career and her family, so severe that she had retreated into the relative safety of teaching high school civics, but the fire of her old profession still burned within her. She noticed when Tiago, one of her brightest students, began asking unusually sophisticated questions during class, questions about corporate law, about journalistic ethics, about the Freedom of Information Act. "You're investigating someone, aren't you?" she asked him one afternoon after class, her experienced eyes recognizing the signs immediately. Tiago hesitated for only a moment. There was something in the teacher's direct, no-nonsense demeanor, a sense of shared purpose, that made him trust her. "Yes, ma'am," he admitted. "The man who fired my mother." Janet smiled, not with pity, but with a flicker of professional respect. "Show me what you've got." When Tiago presented his preliminary findings, a neatly organized, digital folder filled with annotated documents and flowcharts, Janet was stunned. In 1 week, with nothing but a handful of junked laptops and a public library's Wi-Fi connection, this 17-year-old boy had compiled a dossier of evidence that would have taken an experienced journalist months to gather. "You have a natural talent for this, Tiago," she admitted, her voice a mixture of admiration and caution. "A gift. But you need to be careful. What you're doing is dangerous. You need legal guidance, so you don't make any mistakes that could not only hurt your case, but put you and your mother in real jeopardy." Meanwhile, Richard Whitmore, blissfully unaware of the digital ghost haunting his past, continued his campaign of petty cruelty with the supreme confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences. He had hired a private security firm to monitor the Santos family, convinced that they would try to retaliate in some primitive, predictable way. "People like them are emotional, not strategic," he commented to his lawyer over the phone. A conversation that, unbeknownst to him, was being recorded. "They'll probably try to sue for wrongful dismissal, or maybe create some kind of scandal on social media. Nothing that a few $1,000s in legal fees and a good PR team can't handle." What Richard didn't know, what his expensive security consultants had failed to discover, was that his own state-of-the-art mansion surveillance system had a glaring vulnerability. In his arrogance, Richard had insisted on having remote access to the system via his smartphone, creating a backdoor that a skilled programmer, someone who understood network protocols better than the technicians who had installed the system, could exploit. Tiago wasn't just watching Richard's past, he was watching his present. Confined to her gilded prison, Isabella found her own ingenious way to fight back. Her new nurse, a compassionate woman named Rosa who had a son of her own and couldn't ignore the glaring injustice of the situation, secretly allowed the girl to use her personal phone. "I need to talk to Tiago," Isabella had begged, her voice filled with an urgency that Rosa couldn't deny. "Just for 5 minutes, please." When they finally connected, their conversation, a whispered, clandestine exchange, Isabella provided the crucial piece of information that even Tiago's exhaustive online investigation had failed to uncover. "My father has a secret office," she whispered into the phone, the words tumbling out in a rush. "In the basement, behind the wine cellar. I hear him in there every night, talking to people I've never seen before. He calls it his war room, and there's a safe, a big one, hidden behind a portrait of my grandfather." Tiago absorbed every detail, his strategic mind instantly connecting this new information with everything he had already discovered. The puzzle was coming together, and the final picture was going to be more devastating than he had even imagined. Professor Morrison introduced Tiago to Marcus Chen, a brilliant, aggressive civil rights lawyer who worked pro bono on cases of social and racial injustice. Marcus was intrigued, not only by the mountain of evidence the young man had compiled, but by the sheer sophistication of his approach. "You're 17 years old," Marcus observed during their first meeting, his office walls covered with framed newspaper articles detailing his past victories against corporate and government corruption. "And you're already putting together better cases than some of the third-year law students I teach. But we need to be careful. Men like Whitmore, they don't just have the resources to destroy lives. They have the resources to make people disappear." Professor Chen, Tiago replied, with that disconcerting serenity that his mother now recognized as the calm before a storm. "They can only destroy what you allow them to see, and I have been very, very careful about what I have let them see." Over the next 2 weeks, while Richard Whitmore celebrated his supposed victory, confident that he had crushed the insignificant Santos family, Tiago worked 18 hours a day, refining his plan. He was no longer just a researcher, he was an architect, building a case so airtight, so meticulously documented, so irrefutable that it would be a legal and public relations nuke. Every insult, every display of arrogance, every act of cruelty Richard committed was carefully recorded, filed, and cross-referenced. Carmen watched her son's transformation with a mixture of awe and trepidation. The boy who had always been mature for his age now displayed a strategic depth that was almost frightening. His sleepless nights were spent not on video games or social media, but on building something she didn't yet fully understand. "Mom," Tiago said one morning, finally closing the last of his laptops and stretching after another all-night session, "You know that story about Grandpa building our first house, brick by brick?" "Of course, son. He didn't just prove that the racists who tried to stop him were wrong," Tiago said, a new, hard light in his eyes. "He built something that lasted for generations. something that gave our family a foundation. He smiled, and for the first time in weeks, Carmen recognized the genuine, joyful smile of her son. Richard Whitmore thinks he knows me. He thinks I'm just another angry kid who will lash out and then give up when the anger passes. Carmen felt a chill run down her spine, not of fear, but of anticipation. What he doesn't know, Tiago continued, opening a final folder on his computer, a folder that contained months of meticulous, painstaking work, is that I'm not just building revenge. I'm building a legacy, and when I'm done, this entire city, this entire country, will know exactly who Richard Whitmore really is. At that moment, with the first light of dawn illuminating her son's determined face, Carmen realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. In the fertile ground of Richard Whitmore's cruel, casual arrogance, an unstoppable force had been born, a force fueled not by anger, but by a relentless, brilliant pursuit of justice that was about to change the lives of everyone involved. Forever. Monday morning began like any other for Richard Whitmore. He woke in his 1,000 thread count sheets, drank his expensive, ethically questionable coffee, and scanned the headlines of the Wall Street Journal. It was not until he was in the back of his chauffeured Bentley, gliding through the morning traffic, that his phone began to explode. 53 missed calls before 8 a.m. His personal secretary was hysterical. His corporate communications director was unreachable. A frantic text from his wife simply said, "Reporters are surrounding the house. What did you do? What the hell is going on?" Richard roared at his lawyer, Harrison Wells, who burst into his penthouse office without knocking, his face the color of bleached parchment. Wells closed the heavy oak door and activated the soundproofing, a protocol reserved only for the most devastating company-ending crises. "Richard, it's over," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Someone leaked everything. And when I say everything, I mean absolutely everything." On the massive computer screen that dominated one wall of the office, Wells opened a dozen web pages simultaneously. The Herald Tribune's banner headline screamed, "Real estate magnate Richard Whitmore at center of massive money laundering and bribery scandal." The Financial Times had published an exhaustive, deeply sourced expose on his fraudulent government contracts, but it was the Washington Post's headline that made the air leave Richard's lungs, that made him physically slump in his custom-made Italian leather chair. Secret recordings reveal Whitmore's plans to intimidate and eliminate federal witnesses. "That's impossible," Richard whispered, his hands shaking as he scrolled through the articles, each one a new, devastating blow. They had everything: the shell companies, the offshore accounts, the names of the bribed officials, the threats against the Santos family. No one had access to that information. "My office is swept for bugs weekly. My phones are encrypted." Wells interrupted him, his finger pointing to a specific section of the Post's article. "They don't just have documents, Richard. They have audio, crystal clear audio recordings of your conversations, the ones you had in your war room, the ones where you discussed in detail how you were going to solve the Santos problem after they got involved, where they shouldn't have." Richard's blood ran cold. Those conversations had taken place in his most private, most secure sanctuary, the secret basement office that not even his wife knew existed. "Who?" he croaked, his voice a strangled, unfamiliar sound. "Who could have done this?" The answer arrived at that exact moment, in the form of an email, delivered exclusively to Richard's personal, encrypted account. The sender's address was one he recognized with a jolt of sickening dread: investigate.whitmore@gmail.com. The signature was simple, elegant, and utterly devastating. T.S. Mr. Whitmore, over the past 6 weeks, I have systematically documented your criminal activities. This was accomplished through the careful analysis of public records, legally obtained audio and video recordings from security breaches in your own systems, and testimony from the many people you have so severely underestimated. Your shell companies have been mapped. Your fraudulent contracts have been exposed. Your threats against my family have been recorded. Your deliberate criminal negligence toward your own daughter has been filmed and documented. You once said that people like me are predictable. You were right. I predicted exactly how you would react when your arrogance was challenged. The difference between us is simple. You use your power to destroy innocent lives. I use my intelligence to protect those I love and to expose those who cause harm. P.S. The federal authorities, including the FBI and the IRS, received a complete copy of all my findings an hour ago. As of 20 minutes ago, all of your personal and corporate accounts have been frozen. Sincerely, Tiago Santos, the boy you underestimated. Richard read the email 3 times, his mind refusing to process the reality of the words on the screen. A 17-year-old boy, the son of his cleaning lady, had single-handedly destroyed an empire that had taken his family 3 generations to build. "This can't be happening," he muttered, his hands sweating as he frantically tried to access his online bank accounts on his phone. Access denied. "All of them, Richard, there's more," Wells said, his voice barely audible. "They have a video of you threatening the Santos family on the day you fired them. Someone must have hidden a camera in your office during the conversation." In truth, there had been no hidden camera. Isabella, using her nurse's phone, had simply placed an open call to Tiago, who had recorded the entire conversation. But Richard didn't need to know those technical details. All he needed to know was that he had been outmaneuvered, outthought, and utterly, completely destroyed. His phone rang. The caller ID read, "Federal Bureau of Investigation." Mr. Whitmore, a calm, professional female voice said, "This is Special Agent Victoria Torres. We have a search and seizure warrant for your properties and corporate offices. We request your immediate presence at our downtown field office to clarify the charges of money laundering, tax fraud, and witness intimidation." As Richard tried to formulate a response, to summon the blustering, intimidating presence that had served him so well his entire life, Wells whispered urgently, "They're already at the mansion, Richard. Social services is there. They're interviewing Isabella about parental neglect and living in a toxic home environment." The irony was a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. He had spent weeks boasting about how he had put that insignificant family in their place, never once imagining that every act of cruelty, every word of contempt, was being meticulously documented and turned into another brick in the wall of his own prison. Across town, Tiago watched the news unfold. On a small television in the living room of their rented apartment, his mother sat beside him, tears streaming down her face, not of sadness, but of a profound, overwhelming pride in the son who had turned a brutal, soul-crushing injustice into a masterclass in dignity and intelligence. "Son, how?" she asked, her voice filled with a sense of wonder. "How did you do all of this?" "Mum, you always taught me that education is the one thing no one can ever take away from you," he said, his eyes fixed on the screen, where Richard Whitmore's corporate logo was being displayed under the banner headline of Criminal Enterprise. Richard Whitmore forgot that intelligence doesn't have a color, it doesn't have a social class, it doesn't have a zip code. He underestimated me because he saw a black kid from the projects. He didn't see a programmer, he didn't see a natural strategist. He didn't see someone who has learned to turn every obstacle into fuel. His own phone began to ring. It was Professor Morrison, her voice ecstatic. "Tiago, 3 universities have already called me. They've heard about your investigative work, Harvard, MIT, and Stanford. They all want to talk to you this week. They're talking about full scholarships, about creating new programs based on your work." An hour later, Marcus Chen, the lawyer, showed up at their door, his face split by a grin of pure, unadulterated triumph. He was holding a set of official documents. "Isabella's court-appointed guardians have filed a request," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "A request for you to be named her official educational mentor while she is under state protection. She specifically asked for you. She said you were the only one who ever really taught her anything important." At that moment, as the sound of sirens echoed faintly through the city, all of them converging on the various properties of the Whitmore Empire, Tiago Santos smiled. It was the serene, confident smile of someone who had just proven a fundamental, unshakable point. True strength does not come from inherited wealth or brute force power. It comes from the ability to transform injustice into opportunity, humiliation into motivation, and contempt into an absolute, unbending determination to see justice done. Richard Whitmore had tried to destroy a family out of pure, unthinking prejudice. In response, he had received a masterclass in how intelligence, when combined with a righteous purpose, can bring down entire empires built on rotten foundations. The real estate mogul who had woken up that morning believing he controlled the destinies of others, was now facing the stark reality that his own destiny had been sealed by a young man he had dismissed as nothing more than a bug to be crushed under his heel. The crucial difference, the one that had decided the outcome of this war, was that Tiago Santos had never underestimated underestimated anyone, especially not the self-destructive power of blind arrogance in men who confuse their privilege with superiority. 6 months after the spectacular headline-grabbing implosion of the Whitmore Empire, the transformation in Thiago Santos's life felt like something out of a Hollywood movie, but it was grounded in the absolute, undeniable reality of his own making. The young man who had been humiliated and unceremoniously expelled from a mansion now walked the hallowed, ivy-covered halls of Harvard University, the recipient of a full custom-designed scholarship in a dual major program of computer science and digital law. "Mom, look at this," Thiago said, holding out his phone to Carmen as they sat in a bustling Cambridge coffee shop, a world away from the cramped kitchen that had served as his war room. The Boston Herald's headline was stark: "Former tycoon Richard Whitmore sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for money laundering, racketeering, and witness intimidation." Carmen smiled, but her pride was no longer just about the downfall of the man who had tried to destroy her family. It was deeper, more profound. "Son," she said, her eyes shining, "do you remember when you were 8 years old, and you took apart that old radio I brought home from my cleaning job? You remember how angry I was? I thought you had broken it." "I remember," laughed. "I was angry because I didn't understand," she continued, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't understand that you weren't breaking it. You were trying to understand how it worked on the inside. Today, looking at you now, I realize you've always been able to see how things work on the inside. Things that other people can't even see are there." Thiago's story had become a national phenomenon, a modern-day David and Goliath tale for the digital age. There were 3 competing documentary offers, a book deal in the works, and dozens of requests for interviews. University sociology and ethics departments began teaching the Santos case as a masterclass in asymmetrical power dynamics and the role of information as an equalizer. Isabella, now living with a carefully selected foster family and thriving under the care of therapists and educators who saw her potential instead of her limitations, continued her study sessions with Thiago via video chat. At 16, she had become a surprisingly eloquent and passionate activist for the rights of people with disabilities, using her own experience to expose the subtle, insidious ways that prejudice can exist even within the most privileged of families. "Taught me that being underestimated can be your greatest advantage," she had said in a speech at her new school that had gone viral. "While people are busy looking down on you, you can be building something they never, ever expected." On the other side of the country, Richard Whitmore was serving his sentence at the federal penitentiary in Danbury, Connecticut. His vast fortune had been confiscated, his mansions and luxury cars auctioned off to pay fines and restitution to the numerous victims of his corporate malfeasance. His elite friends now avoided any mention of his name, and his wife had divorced him before the trial was even over, issuing a public statement claiming she had been deceived for years about the true character of the man she married. In a letter that was never sent, found by guards during a routine cell search, Richard had written a single, revealing paragraph: "I completely underestimated the boy. I thought that power and money were enough to crush anyone who dared to challenge me. I never imagined that someone could have the intelligence and the patience to build my own destruction brick by brick, using my own arrogance as the mortar." The irony was perfect, almost poetic. The man who had spent his life belittling people for their color, their class, their station in life, now shared a 6 by 9 foot cell with exactly the kind of men he had always despised. And they, unlike him, treated him with a basic human dignity he had never shown to anyone he considered beneath him. Marcus Chen, the lawyer who had mentored Thiago, now ran the Santa Strewn Institute for Digital Justice, an organization funded by a flood of donations that had poured in from across the country after the story went viral. Thiago proved that in today's digital world, truth can travel faster than lies, and that intelligence can be a more effective weapon for justice than a law degree. Chen explained in an interview Professor Janet Morrison, who had been the first to recognize Thiago's raw investigative talent, now taught a new, over-enrolled course at her high school, Citizen Journalism and Social Responsibility. "My students learned that every one of us has the power to be an agent of change," she would say, her pride in her former student evident in her voice. "Thiago proved that your age, your background, and your financial resources do not determine your ability to make a difference." 3 years later, during his magna cum laude graduation from Harvard, Tiago was invited to be the class speaker. Standing before thousands of his peers, his mother weeping silently with pride in the front row, he shared the lesson he had learned on that fateful, sun-drenched day at the Whitmore's pool. When Richard Whitmore looked at me with contempt and told me that I didn't know my place, he began, his voice clear and steady. He was right, in a way he could never have imagined. I didn't know my place, because my place was not something that could be determined by the address where I was born, or the color of my skin, or my mother's profession. My place, I have learned, is determined by my ability to turn injustice into fuel, to turn ignorance into opportunity, to turn hatred into a reason to build something better. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the sea of faces before him. True revenge isn't about destroying those who have hurt you. It's about building something so extraordinary, so meaningful, that they are forced to recognize that they wasted an opportunity to have you on their side. It's about proving that your greatness was never ever dependent on their approval. The audience rose to their feet in a thunderous standing ovation that seemed to last for a full 5 minutes. Among those present were dozens of young people from humble, overlooked backgrounds who had been inspired by Tiago's story to pursue their own impossible dreams. Carmen, at 62, now ran her own successful, ethical cleaning company, employing other women from her community at fair wages and with full benefits. My son taught me that we should never accept the box that others try to put us in. She would tell anyone who asked, "We are the ones who decide the size and shape of our own lives." The story that had begun with a heroic dive into a swimming pool had created ripples of change that had spread across the country. It had sparked conversations about unconscious bias in boardrooms and classrooms. It had inspired a new generation of digital activists. It had proven that the old structures of power were not as immutable as they seemed. Richard Whitmore had tried to teach Tiago Santos his place in society. In response, Tiago had taught the entire world that no place is too small, no voice too quiet, for someone with enough greatness to turn injustice into opportunity. Final lesson was crystal clear. Arrogance is a self-devouring beast, but intelligence, when combined with a just and righteous purpose, can build legacies that last for generations. Tiago had not only defeated Richard Whitmore, he had proven that true power never lies in bank accounts or property deeds, but in the unwavering ability to see potential where others see only prejudice.